This session is going to be about political teleology. The speaker today is Péter Lautner. Péter Lautner teaches philosophy at the Péter Catholic University. He worked for various international projects, has been contributing to the Ancient Commentators on Aristotle project since 1991, published widely on late ancient and Byzantine philosophy, particularly on psychology and epistemology, but more recently on ethics as well. His title is Political Teleology, the teleological nature of governmental systems in Aristotle's Politics.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Okay. I'm really honored. I hope also your project is about, I guess, more on teleology in nature, in metaphysics, but I guess that what I'm going to say has something to contribute to teleology in Aristotle's views in general, perhaps. So my aim is to shed some light on the teleological nature of governmental systems or cultures in Aristotle's political theory. Teleological system, a governmental system or governmental culture translates politeia, Greek, and it might cause some confusion later on, but I think we can sort it out very efficiently. The aim itself involves certain constraints. I'm not going to discuss the banal, though interesting claim that political action is teleological because political actors aim at achieving something. It's an interesting claim, for one might be toying with the idea that the result of badly orchestrated actions may not mean the particular objectives of any actors involved. If this is the case, how can we talk about teleology of collective actions? I'm not going to dwell on Aristotle's notion of the teleological nature of politics in general either, though at some point a short notice may be useful for showing the broader context of the theology in governmental systems. Teleology in governments involves two things: that the system as a whole serves a certain purpose, and that the institutions within are also at the service of such a goal. As we see it in many other cases as well, Aristotle's views on teleology in politics are formulated within the context of Plato's theory, and therefore it is reasonable to explain them against this background. My thesis I'm going to put forward now relies very much on this comparison. I'm trying to show that for Plato, political teleology of governmental systems is overwhelmingly intentional. It depends on the intentions of political actors. Whereas in Aristotle, this kind of teleology involves both intentionality and functionality. Governmental systems or institutions function independently to some extent, and it's with emphasis that to some extent. Their goal is not defined with reference to the intentions of political actors. That's what independence makes here. Plato's views on the development of governmental cultures occupy book 8 and 9 of his Republic. He has already completed the description of the best possible form of state, and now turns to examine forms that are less advanced. He describes the different forms as stages in a process of decline. Right at the beginning, however, he faces a problem. Even if the best possible state is not a perfect state, for instance, the justice ruling here can only be an image of the idea of justice. He has to find a reason why the process of decline gets going in the first place. If this is a state which provides the conditions for each citizen to flourish, how could it happen that it starts on the path of decay? The change begins not within the structure of the state, but from the psychological qualities of the political actors, in this case, members of the ruling class. If we look for a causal explanation for why different systems of government have changed and how they are maintained, the reason for the change is to be found in the mindset of the political actors. Plato formulates the thesis explicitly when saying that this is the first text on your handout. It's from the Republic. Socrates is saying, are you aware then that there must be as many forms of human character as there are of constitutions? Or do you think constitutions arise from oak or rock and not from the characters of the people in the cities, which tip the scales, so to speak, and drag the rest along with them? Glaucon, no, they could not possibly arise from anything other than that. And again, Socrates, so if there are 5 types of cities, there must be also 5 ways of arranging private individual souls. The 5 types of governmental systems or cultures are the best possible state, called also aristocracy, meaning the rule of the best, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. The best possible state has fallen because the rulers are incapable of performing the difficult calculations that are necessary for the governance of the state and require sense perception, which is a constant source of error. On the other hand, the rulers of the best possible state cannot meet the severe conditions Plato imposed on them. For, in order to be fully impartial, they should have given up private property and family life. All of their private feelings should have been collected, the same feelings of everybody in a given age group within the ruling class. For instance, by loving every child as his or her own. It didn't work, however, which led to the formation of private preferences. In such circumstances, there could not be any question of impartial management of the state. In the new governmental culture, democracy, the rulers tend to be drawn not from the ranks of the wise and virtuous, but from people of a competitive type. They belong to the ruling class, not by merit, but by birth. Due to the personal preferences of their parents, their place in the ruling class is secured. Democracy has, this is just a short quotation, one striking characteristic, which comes from the dominance of the spirited element in the soul, love of victory and honor, end of quote. Alongside their love for honor, they also develop a strain for the love of money, and as a consequence, they allow themselves private property. In Plato's description, as they are growing old, their passion of money becomes all-powerful. This is the passion that dominates the next governmental form, which is the oligarchy. It is a form of governmental culture and society in which wealth is the be-all and end-all. Oligarchic behavior reflects the dominance in the soul, not of reason or spirit, but of the appetitive and money-loving element. For the distribution of political power is still the same as the one we find in the best possible state, in which the productive classes are fully deprived of the political rights. Excessive greed results in excessive exploitation of the productive class. Small wonder that the upshot will be awful for the oligarch. In due course, The wealthy lose all capacity for self-discipline and indulge in idle luxury, while the poor become disenfranchised, get into debt, and grow more and more disaffected. The body politic is notoriously sick and may become openly conflicted at the slightest provocation. In such circumstances, if sensing weakness in the ruling oligarchy, the poor may well overthrow the regime and institute democracy with its egalitarian institutions. In democracy, the citizenry comes to relish its anarchistic freedom to do as it chooses. Likewise, the soul of the democratic person is anarchistic. Freedom to do as it chooses. There is no difference made between various desires, and long-term planning becomes increasingly insecure. Because of such a mindset of the rulers, nominally the whole body of the citizens, the city sinks into anarchy. Mutual hostility and suspicion grow until the poor look for a champion who becomes the architect of civil war against those who own property. This ringleader then inevitably requests and acquires a bodyguard, which provides the conditions for tyranny. Unlike the democratic system of government, tyranny is present in a state which is fully controlled by one single person, whose soul is also fully controlled by the appetite, in this case, by the desire for power. Every other ability, including the intellect, is put at the service of it. The centralized soul responds to a centralized state, where disregard for the law is widespread, not only for the written laws establishing criteria for office, but also for the unwritten customs forbidding licentiousness or harmful behavior. Plato's narrative draws attention to three phenomena. First, it seems that the narrative describes an ordered sequence of degenerated forms of government. It is an ordered sequence, not just random succession, for each form contains the conditions for the form that follows it. Two samples may suffice. Without the extreme separation of social groups in oligarchical society, which, as a matter of fact, contains cities, one for the rich and one for the poor, no democratic government would ever come to power. Moreover, the anarchistic turmoil of Plato's democratic regime provides the condition for tyrannical takeover. If one ringleader does not succeed, there will be several others who are ready to make a try. The conditions are there. Second, if there is indeed a high probability that one particular system of government will emerge from another particular one, and there is no alternative, then we may distinguish two kinds of teleology. The distinction is based on the nature of the development of governmental systems. On Plato's account, the development seems to be a one-way street, starting from the best possible state and terminating in tyranny. There are stages in the process which we have to go through, but there are no crossroads or forks. It seems as if the change into one governmental system were encoded somehow in the previous system. The distinction follows this pattern. Teleology is linked to intentionality on the one hand and to functionality on the other. It is linked to intentionality because, and it is a truism, political actors act with a certain purpose. But it is also linked to functionality because at the level of the systems, there seems to be a fixed direction in which each of which develops. In that case, we have to ask for the purpose of the system, including its institutions, or the goal they serve. In Plato's account, however, the way institutions work is fully determined by the mindset of the rulers. The distinction is also tied to the notion of historical law, of which I shall have something to say soon. Third, just to emphasize this last point, the one on functional and intentional teleology. There is an interesting discrepancy in the development of institutions and the psychology of the ruling group. As for the latter, each form of governmental systems corresponds to a kind of mindset. We can talk about, for instance, democracy just as about democratic souls. By contrast, we cannot say that each governmental system has its own specific institutional structure, institutional setup. The best possible state, democracy, and oligarchy all have the same institutions. Still, they are fairly different forms of government. Oligarchy and the best possible state do not differ in respect of their institutions. So, the difference is due to the character of the rulers. If this is the case, however, we cannot find a strict correspondence between institutions and governmental systems, and therefore we cannot assume that there is a one-to-one correspondence between teleological nature. We certainly cannot assume that the specific purpose of the institution determines the way the system works. At this point, we have to bear in mind the causal history of each governmental form. As the text quoted above shows, Plato insists that the ruling group is responsible for these forms. Psychological qualities determine the governmental system of the city. If this is the case, teleology at the level of the system and its institutions derives from the mindset of the rulers, as I said. They will determine the purpose of the whole system and its institutions. This sounds an overly psychological explanation, and it is this, by and large. To mitigate the challenge that such claim prevents or might prevent, however, there are 3 points to be emphasized. First, with such a view on the sources of political structures and actions, Plato does not occupy a unique position in the era. Thucydides, the historiographer of the previous generation, expressed a similar view when saying that the sources of political action are psychological. They are the fear and self-interest, and that's all. Second, obviously, even if the psychological explanation applies to the functioning of governmental forms, one cannot claim that their development, that is, their decline into an inferior form, is always intentional in the sense that either individually or collectively, members of the ruling group intend such a scenario. Third, if we insist on the dominance of the psychological explanation, we may run the risk of reducing the explanations of historical or political processes to explanations drawing on human psychology. This kind of reduction, however, is not possible in Plato's account. The reason is that in the discussion on the transition from democracy to tyranny, and only here, so that's not something, it's not a general assumption on his behalf. So in the discussion on the transition from democracy to tyranny, he refers to a general law that governs historical processes as well. Again, this is Republic, Book 8, sorry. Socrates. The same disease that developed in oligarchy and destroyed it also develops here, only more widespread and virulent because of the general permissiveness, and eventually enslaves democracy. In fact, excessive action in one direction usually sets up a great reaction in the opposite direction. This happens in seasons, in plants, in bodies, and particularly in constitutions. Are there mountains? Yeah, that's probably right. This is a general law which applies not only human societies, but also to natural phenomena, especially living beings such as plants. It is attested in the Phaedo as well, where Plato makes use of it in the so-called Psychical argument for the immortality of the soul. The argument starts with the thesis that, I quote it again, this is the third text on your handout, Socrates. Are we satisfied then that all things come to be in this way, opposite things from opposites? CBs? Socrates. Now again, do these things have a further feature of this sort? Between the members of every pair of opposites, since they are two, aren't there two processes of coming to be, from one to another, and back again, from the latter? Thus, between a larger thing and a smaller, isn't there increase and decrease? So that in the one case we speak of increasing, and in the other of decreasing. CBs again? Yes. Later on, Plato illustrates the point by referring to the examples of sleeping and wakefulness, or heat and cold. It is not a specific law of historical processes, then. It is a universal law, impersonal, without any reference to intentions, and so it seems to functions. At first sight, then, it does not involve any kind of teleology at all. Furthermore, it is not evident at all that there is a global teleology in the background, although Plato is committed. He is committed to natural teleology in his dialogue on the generation of the cosmos that I make. There is a dispute about the role of this universal law here, whether it is a sufficient condition for the transition from democracy to tyranny or not. For present purposes, we can leave the details behind with the note that even if it is a sufficient condition, psychological explanations have their place in the scheme, referring to subservient or auxiliary causes. In sum, we find that social and political processes and states are explained most of the time, except for this general law, with reference to psychological factors. These factors determine highly probable scenarios concerning the development of governmental forms. The teleology inherent in such processes and states is, with the proviso just mentioned, connected to the intentions of the political actors. In a way, it is a highly economical and therefore attractive kind of explanation. So the question we have to ask is this. Plato had laid the tracks of his argument so invitingly. So why does Aristotle avoid traveling down them? After all, they are in the same boat when fighting against the mechanistic explanations of natural processes that were put on the table by the atomists. As the mechanistic explanations were meant to be global, they were also applied to social processes. Aristotle took a different route, by the way, And the reason for the deviation from his teacher's ideas seems to be twofold. First, his commitment to empirical research prevented him to consider teleology as linked to intentions, divine or human alike, or linked only to intentions. That's the better formulation. Second, and more to the point of political teleology, his research in the field of historical structures, histories, and governmental forms of cities and states enabled him to notice that structural factors can also be responsible for changes, sometimes declines, of one form into another. In Aristotle's political thought, such a teleological approach results in what we call political naturalism. The main thesis of his political naturalism is that man is by nature a political animal, and it has two readings, a narrow and a broad one. According to the narrow reading, it means that human beings live in polis, which is not only a more complex structure than village or household, but more importantly, constituted in order that humans not only survive, but live well as well. It also emphasizes that there is no other animal than man, human being, that can be political, since being political requires having logos, in this case, meaning meaningful speech. And only humans have logos, whereby they can express not only pleasure and pain, but also what is useful or harmful, and hence what is just or unjust. According to the broad reading, on the other hand, the thesis means that human beings are sociable animals. Due to language and intelligence, humans are the most companionable among all animals that live in groups. Connected to this, he argues for the teleological nature of the polis as a whole. Interestingly enough, this teleology is twofold. He famously claims, this is almost the very beginning of his Politics. I quote, this is the text 4 on your handout. When several villages are united in a single complete community, large enough to be nearly or quite self-sufficing, the city comes into existence, originating for the sake of the bare needs of life and continuing its existence for the sake of a good life. And therefore, if the earlier forms of society are natural, so is the city. For it is the end of them, and the nature of a thing is its end. For what each thing is when fully developed, we call its nature, whether we are speaking of a man, a horse, or a family. Besides, the final cause and the end of a thing is the best, and to be self-sufficing is the end and the best. The city has done a double goal. Its coming to be is for the sake of providing the means for bare life. Its existence, however, or its continuing existence, is for the sake of the happy life of its citizens. It allows its citizens to lead a happy life, that is, to achieve the highest ethical goal that they cannot achieve except in polis. The text also suggests that the city is natural because its ingredients, the household or the village, are natural as well. In this form, it is not a terribly convincing argument, but Aristotle immediately adds another reason as well. He says that, just a short quotation, for it is the end of them, and the nature of a thing is its end. Military alliance, on the other hand, the means used by cities to satisfy their need for security, but it is not at all the end or nature of the cities that participate. Quite the opposite. The alliance is made for the sake of preserving the city. To put it otherwise, the city is an organic composite in which it is the whole that gives meaning to each of the parts. So that's the usual Aristotelian scheme of functional explanations. Aristotle, I guess you are familiar with that, so I'm not going to enter into detail, favors a kind of top-down explanation. So not a bottom-up explanation. These are being for top-down explanations in biology, first of all. Here we find again the well-known Aristotelian notion of two priorities. From the perspective of generation, the parts come to be before the whole, according to priority for us. But from the conceptual perspective, it is the whole that is prior to the parts. It is a natural priority because it is with regard to this priority that the parts have their function and thus are defined. So there are two kinds of priorities here. There is a kind of generic priority. Aristotle uses a genealogical explanation of how polis comes about. And from this point of view, parts precede the whole. But from a conceptual view, the whole has priority, because with reference to the whole, it is with reference to the whole that we can precisely describe the reason why parts function in the way they do. We also have to see that the teleology expressed here is not connected to psychological factors whatsoever. Instead, teleology is linked to nature in the sense that natural things have a tendency to unfold the potentialities within them. Nature is the goal in the sense that the fully developed individuum is the aim of natural processes. It is the goal to which these processes are directed for, because it is the fully developed individuum in which the natural capabilities characteristic to the species become a reality. Similarly, the polis provides the framework within which human beings can fulfill their natural abilities. For this reason, it is a goal for human activities and the best form of human associations, other forms being incapable for providing the framework in which human beings can flourish in the full sense. Of course, household can provide some conditions for survival. The aim of the household is survival, for instance, or the aim of the association of men with women is to provide offsprings, etc. So we have all sorts of goal-directed structures here, but every goal-directed structure, except for the polis, are just partial in the sense that polis can provide the full conditions for human beings to flourish. If we turn to the various governmental systems, we have to have in mind that their general goal is the same. They come about to provide the conditions for bell life and exist for the sake of the well-being of its citizens. As a governmental form, however, the polis has many types. The first distinction is between the purposes of political power. The governmental systems which aim at the common advantage are correct and just, without qualification. whereas those which aim only at the advantage of the rulers are deviant and unjust, because they involve despotic rule which is inappropriate for a community of free persons. We see that the criterion of the division is the aim they are striving for. If it is the common advantage, they are correct, if not, not. Combined with the notion according to which the polis exists for the sake of the living well of its citizens, the new criterion introduces a normative aspect according to which the good polis exists for the happiness of all of its citizens. If you ask what about states where no such equalities prevail, Aristotle would answer that these are not cities, not polis at all. These rather resemble to the household. For instance, Aristotle again famously claims that kingship is basically a village, because it is in the village that paternalistic relations prevail, just like in a kingship where paternalistic relations prevail. So to have a polis is a very normative thing. You can see that. To have a polis, you need citizens with equal rights. If they don't have equal rights, that's a kind of village. They can be huge villages. In Aristotle's times, Persian Empire was a huge village, but nevertheless, they don't. Persian Empire, for instance, doesn't meet the conditions for being a polis. So the basic division between correct and deviant governmental systems is combined with the observation that the government can consist of one single person, a minority of citizens, or a majority. Hence, we have 6 possible governmental forms. The deviant ones are tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, whereas the correct and just ones are kingship, aristocracy, and polity. The classification is theoretical, also in the sense that when Aristotle starts examining cities or states that exist in his time, he finds that most of the governmental systems contain elements of more than one form. Most of them are mixed systems, or to use another received formula, they are mixed constitutions. This is one point, among others, where Aristotle finds fault with Plato's theory of the state. He believes that the Republic contains a highly simplified account of the transformation of one governmental form into another. It is a sheer simplification to attribute the transition from, say, democracy to oligarchy, or from oligarchy to democracy, to a single cause. Plato's failure lies in his resistance to investigating the variety of political systems that Aristotle identified, and in his speaking of such changes as if there were one sort of each. That is, to take one example, as if the change of democracy into tyranny were inevitable and caused by a single factor. Aristotle employs a multitude of historical examples to support the claim that Plato's theory, so abstracted as it is from experience, is inadequate. In Aristotle's view, we need to do research into the structure of existing states to substantiate any claim on the nature of governmental systems and politics in general. What he sees is variety. The many different forms of oligarchies, the many different forms of democracies or kingships. One should immerse into the study of the vast variety of governmental forms, and consequently, the great variety of causes for change or decline. In order to understand the nature of change in governmental system, one should not rely on the claim that attributes such as change or decline that attributes such a change or decline to a singular cause. Aristotle is happy to give us a detailed list of different forms of transition, from oligarchy to tyranny, from oligarchy to aristocracy, and yes, from oligarchy to democracy, to mention just the ways oligarchic regimes can change. The change can occur within one form also. By introducing new magistrates or abolishing old ones, an oligarchy can become more oligarchic. To formulate his case in terms of the teleological nature of the polis, he might say that he rejects the reductionist claim that tries to deduce teleology in the city from a single factor, the intentions of the rulers. In this way, he loosens the bond between teleology and intentionality. This is not to say, of course, that he denies any connections between the two. There are cases where the intentionality of the political actors has a major role. He only denies that the teleology of the polis is fully reducible to the intentions of the actors. What he emphasizes instead is that the teleology of governmental systems rests primarily on the functions of the institutions and the systems themselves. To see this at work, we have to turn to his analysis of existing forms of government. This is how we reach Book 5 of the Politics, in which Aristotle sets out to investigate the history and institutions of existing cities. Right at the beginning, he makes it clear that he makes it clear what he is going to discuss. I quote, this is the fifth text of the handout. Following what has been said, this is what must now be investigated. From what causes political systems change, and their number and the nature. What kinds of decay characterize each political system, and from what forms and into what forms they are most likely to change. Furthermore, what safeguards each political system has both individually and in common with others, and through what measures each political system might be best secured. It is striking at first glance that the end of the political processes is not fixed in the way we find it in Plato. The text for instance, the text talks about measures to be taken if we want to secure the existing political system. It also stresses likelihood. One political system can change into another with a certain probability. The development Aristotle alludes to here does not resemble a one-way street without crossroads or forks. More importantly, the analysis centers around the role of institutions in the process. Institutional mechanisms can mitigate or sometimes overcome the conflicts that arise between competing parties. Viewed from the perspective of the theological nature of the city, institutions can work in a way to advance the goal of the existence of the city. One could argue, therefore, that the assessment of their role is based on norms, which is analogous to norms in nature. Just one example, the purpose of the acorn is to become an oak, and its development is to be judged on the basis of whether it succeeds or falls. Of course, this is not purpose in something personal or psychological sense. It's purpose, well, it's a different formulation for function. So we can reformulate Aristotle's case saying that, okay, the function of the acorn is to become an oak. So it has nothing to do about personal purposes. Or Aristotle is not going into the street of anthropomorphism to give us an anthropomorphic picture of nature. There were efforts in antiquity to do so, but Aristotle doesn't belong to this club. I'm not sure I can take this path without reservation, but I'm ready to admit that the structure and the functioning of human institutions can be assessed by using such a criterion, such a functional criterion. The specific goal of the polis makes it possible. The specific goal of the polis is twofold dimension. If an institution does not serve the flourishing of the citizen, the goal of the existence of the polis, then it deserves negative assessment. If, however, institutions can be judged in this way, then it follows that in assessing them, we focus on their functions. It is a separate item, not to be mixed up with the intentions of people who may run the institution. If this is the case, institutions and governmental systems gain some independence and may have even causal impact on citizens. To take just one example, on describing and praising, it's very interesting for different reasons why Aristotle praises. So on describing and praising the governmental system of Carthage, the Phoenician city-state on North African coast, Aristotle mentions that due to this quality of the institutions, the citizens or the populace remained loyal to the city. In the time of Aristotle, Carthage had existed for roughly 500 years without inner revolts or turmoil. This brings me to the point I was going to show, that in Aristotle's view, teleology of governmental system relies not only on intentions of the rulers. The goal of the polis is defined without reference to intentions, and the assessment of political structures is based on functions. They are good insofar as they contribute to the goal of the polis. Thank you very much for your attention.